We are speaking with Senator Geraldine Thompson, a candidate for District 12, and thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
And we always start these proceedings with a couple of preliminary questions. The first one is, have you ever been arrested before?
I have not.
And have you ever declared bankruptcy?
I have not.
Okay. Well, we can move on from those to the good questions
Okay.
now. Why are you seeking re-election, Senator?
I'm seeking re-election to continue the work that I've begun to address some of the needs of the people in Senate District 12. And Senate District 12 includes portions of Windermere, areas along Sand Lake Road. It includes Winter Garden and Ocoee, and it also includes Washington Shores and Paramore. So you can see that it's a very divergent group of individuals in terms of socioeconomic status. And I have proven that I have the cultural competency to work with both the people in Paramore as well as the people in Windermere. And I think that that's very important in order to be able to address the needs of this particular district.
Given the diversity of that district, did you see any common themes, any common needs between those areas?
Economic development is a common theme, and in the Winter Garden, West Orange County area where there are a lot of agricultural interest, I think we have some opportunities there. One area that is particularly poised for economic development is the town of Oakland, and I was successful in the last legislative session to get funding to begin to move the town of Oakland from septic tank to a sanitary sewer system. And what's important about that is that the state of Florida, through the Department of Transportation, has invested millions of dollars to bring a turnpike exchange directly into the town of Oakland, yet they cannot attract a major hotel, a major restaurant, because the entire town is on septic tank. So tourism, as we all know, is the lifeblood of our industry and our area. And we want the places like the town of Oakland to be able to benefit from tourism, as well as around Lake Apopka, which has some potential for bird watching and fishing and ecotourism, but we've got to invest to clean up Lake Apopka. So those economic development, I think, crosses the spectrum in terms of what the needs are in Senate District 12.
You talked about one of your successes in the last legislative session. Could you give us an honest appraisal of your time in office? What have you done right and what have you done wrong that needs to be improved on?
Well, when I was in the House, I was successful in passing some substantive legislation. One of my first bills was to outlaw female genital mutilation. And as we have people moving to America and to Central Florida from other countries and other cultures, they practiced some traditions that were acceptable where they came from, but are not acceptable here. So I passed a bill that classifies mutilation as child abuse, which is what it is. We were seeing a rash of young girls ending up in our emergency rooms with part of their genitalia cut away, which was customary in their country. These children, because no physician would perform this procedure, had been mutilated by using broken bottles or razors, and many of them were hemorrhaging or infected. And so that was one of the very first things that I did in the Florida House. I also was able in getting $1.8 million for a young boy named Daniel Decembre, who, when he was 8 years old, was playing on the playground of his elementary school, which was in a residential area, and the school was surrounded by a fence. And the particular day that he was there, the gate was left open and a pit bull ran onto the playground and mangled his face, tore his eyes and ears, and he was 13, so 8 years later, as a teenager, he was suffering from a lot of problems in terms of his peers. So I was able to file a claims bill on behalf of Daniel and get him what he needed to have reconstructive surgery. This last legislative session, I was successful in amending Florida's wrongful incarceration statute. We have a compensation statute that requires the production of DNA. It also requires a thorough review of all evidence related to the case where you were are tried. And the case in point that I was concerned about occurred in 1968, where a man named James Joseph Richardson was tried and convicted for allegedly killing his 7 children, all under the age of 10. Mr. Richardson was a citrus worker, and he and his wife Annie Mae would get up very early in the morning and prepare food for these 7 children. They would go off to work, and then they would depend on other people to come and warm the food for the children. And they were notified that the children were ill. They went to the hospital. All 7 children died. Mr. Richardson was arrested and tried and convicted, sentenced to death. He spent 7 years on death row before the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Florida's death penalty as it was practiced then was unconstitutional, and then his sentence was commuted to life. Later, evidence was sent to the governor of Florida, who was Bob Martinez, and it showed that a lot of information had not been introduced at trial, that the sheriff had perjured himself. Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General, was appointed as a special prosecutor. She reviewed everything and issued a no pros memorandum indicating he never should have been charged. By that time, he'd spent nearly 22 years in prison. And then his next door neighbor, who would come and warm the food for the children, confessed that she had put poison in their food because one of his female relatives was involved with her husband. So Mr. Richardson, at 78 years old now, was released from prison but has never been compensated. So I was able to amend that statute so that he can apply to be compensated without the production of DNA, which we didn't, in terms of that science, we were not as familiar with it in 1968 as we are now. And much of the evidence has been lost or destroyed. Many of the people associated with the case are dead. And so Mr. Richardson, on August 12th, will travel to Orlando from Kansas, where he lives now with his cardiologist. He has a heart condition. While he was in prison, he received no Social Security benefits, payments into Social Security, no retirement. So without the bill that I introduced, he would be, as an elderly man, really adrift with nothing. So I'm very proud of being able to do that. I also introduced a bill to clarify that discrimination against pregnant women who are remaining in the workforce is unlawful in the state of Florida. We had different courts in Florida render different decisions with regard to whether pregnancy was or was not covered under our current civil rights statute. That bill passed every committee in the Senate, passed the floor of the entire Senate, passed committees in the House, but before it came to a vote on the floor of the House, the Florida Supreme Court, which was considering a case related to pregnancy, ruled that gender also includes pregnancy. So those were 2 bills in 2014 that I introduced that were successfully concluded.
What about big picture challenges for Florida right now? Kind of macro challenges facing the state. What do you think some of the biggest challenges are, and what do you think the legislature should be doing about them?
One of the biggest challenges, I think, is what are we going to do about public education? We're at a crossroads in terms of whether education will be privatized in the state of Florida. We have for-profit corporations that are operating in Florida to make a buck on the backs of our children, and they operate schools that don't have to meet the same requirements as traditional public schools. So I think, looking at the macro picture here, we have to decide if we're going to give public funds to for-profit corporations to operate schools, will those schools be required to meet the same high standards that traditional public schools are required to meet in terms of assessment, Now you can get funding through a voucher to go to a school, and you don't have to take FCAT, which was required in traditional public schools. The teachers don't have to be certified as they would be in traditional public schools. There's no accountability in terms of what happens to the funding. We had 2 disastrous cases here with the Morning Star School as well as Imani School in Pine Hills, which is in my district, where you had hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars that went missing and schools were closed. Children had no books, no library, whatever. And the taxpayer was left holding the bag for that. And in the case of Imani in particular, when those children went back into traditional public schools, they were behind and they had to be remediated. So it worked to the disadvantage of the children. So I think that's one of the things we have to decide, what are we going to do about public education in the state of Florida. Another issue is our self-defense law, particularly Stand Your Ground, and whether we are going to have a law on the books that allows an aggressor to set things in motion, to provoke an altercation, and because that person thought that someone might have a gun and thought that they may be in jeopardy of bodily harm or losing their life, they are allowed under current law to use deadly force to kill someone and be found not guilty by a jury. So we have a law that allows people to act on their fears rather than the facts. And we've seen 2 instances where young African American men were killed. One in Jacksonville, where there were 10 shots into a car occupied by 4 young men who were playing loud music, and Trayvon Martin just north of here in Sanford. This has business implications for the state of Florida because as I travel throughout the nation, there are groups that are saying they will not hold conventions in Florida because they are fearful for their safety. I talked with a parent who is an alumnus of Florida A&M University and had always dreamed of her son attending Florida A&M, but does not feel that her son would be safe in Florida because you can be killed for walking while black. So I think that's another issue. Obviously, medicinal marijuana, the legislature passed a bill to allow for the production, the cultivation, and dispensing of Charlotte's Web, a particular form of cannabis. But we also have an amendment that will be on the ballot that is broader than just that particular strain of cannabis. So the legislature, if the voters approve the legalization of marijuana for medicinal purpose, it is the legislature that will have to decide how it is going to be legislated, how will it be cultivated, what are the guidelines and the safety measures with regard to dispensation. And I voted against the Charlotte Web bill when it came. I voted for it initially. It went to the House, came back to the Senate with an amendment that restricted it to nurseries that had been in operation for 30 continuous years, which struck me as a carve out for some special interest. I have many agricultural interests in my district, which includes Apopka, Winter Garden, etc., where they grow all kinds of plants. And why would they be excluded? Why are we creating a monopoly for some organization or some individual? So I think that's another thing. And then obviously gambling is going to continue to rear its head, and we're going to have to decide on whether or not we're going to expand gambling in the state of Florida. So those are some of the big picture items.
I take it from the way that we discussed this that you are not a big fan of charter schools.
I don't have opposition to charter schools because they are considered public schools.
Mm-hmm.
So with regard to the curriculum, that is determined by the school boards, and I think that's appropriate. But the problem with charter schools is there's no accountability for the money. And I believe in local control. I believe you elect a school board because they are closest to the people and should be able to make decisions about what's good for children in the area. And this ties the hands of our school boards, which in many instances cannot refuse to grant an application for a charter. So the problem I have is accountability and using taxpayer money in that way.
Okay. Now, on medical marijuana, do you support the amendment that voters are going to be voting on in November?
Well, I don't think that that it really is up to me. I think it's going to be up to the citizens because it's going to be on the ballot, and 60% of the people who vote will have to vote for it to then be legalized. And then I think the legislature comes into the picture in terms of how it's going to be regulated.
They'll have to make a choice. Voters will have to choose, and I think your opinion on it, whether or not they should be supporting it, probably carries some weight with voters, particularly in your district.
I think that it could be something that could work in Florida. If we look at other states and some of the missteps that those states made, we can learn how not to do it. So I think if we look at California, we look at Colorado, we look at some of the other states that have legalized it, we can make sure that we're in a position where we don't have physicians similar to what we had in the case of pill mills that are prescribing what could be addictive medications for minor problems. The question is whether or not you could have doctors who will write a prescription but because they believe that everybody could benefit from medicinal marijuana, that they would never see a case in which they did not think that marijuana could help. I am a breast cancer survivor, and so I know personally what it's like to be very, very ill for a long period of time, dealing with the debilitating effects of chemotherapy. So I think in instances where we can provide medicinal marijuana to deal with the symptoms, epilepsy, people going through what I went through, that could be beneficial. But I think we've got to make sure that we have tight reins on how it's going to be prescribed in the state of Florida.
Okay, and the last big picture issue you mentioned was gambling. Of course, what was on the table was authorizing so-called destination resort casinos. Is that something you support?
It is not. I've looked at the states where gambling has been expanded, and the promises of the revenue that would be generated from those states, I just have not seen. I've not seen it in Louisiana. I look at Mississippi, which is still a very depressed state. I look at Atlantic City and what has happened in Atlantic City. So if the purpose of expanding gambling is to generate revenue for the state of Florida, I don't think that that's going to be forthcoming. I also know that along with gambling, the state is going to spend quite a bit of money on other problems. We're going to need more law enforcement. We're going to need funding for gambling addictions. We devote a portion of the lottery to gambling addiction, so we know that that happens. We're going to have broken homes and all of the things that come along with that, in addition to drugs and prostitution and all of the things that surround gambling. So I don't think that it is a good idea for the state of Florida, and it is a particularly bad idea for Central Florida, where we have worked to build a family-friendly environment, and I don't think that gambling is compatible with that. And even though it might be restricted to Miami, you would have conventions and meetings that might otherwise come to Orlando or Central Florida that might then bypass Central Florida to go to Miami. So I don't see it as a beneficial thing.
Also circling back, you brought up our self-defense law here in the state. Would you please remind us how you voted on the warning shot revision that was just signed into law in June?
I believe I voted for it.
And why was that?
Well, I was thinking of the Marissa Alexander situation. That was House Bill 89, and I did vote for it because it makes no sense to me that you can kill no one, injure no one, and get 60 years in prison, whereas if you kill them, you can walk away scot-free by claiming stand your ground. So I think if you fire a warning shot to say, let's de-escalate this particular situation, that you ought not be charged and have a much stricter penalty than you would if you kill someone. Doesn't make sense to me.
You want to get in on this, Bruce?
Well, I want to circle back around to gambling, and I think I know where you'll go with this, but there was talk in the last session about the legislature actually authorizing expanded gambling instead of putting it up as a constitutional issue to get the 60% as the marijuana initiative would take. So tell me your thoughts on that.
I don't think you'll see the legislature authorizing an expansion of gambling. We have a lot of legislators from the Bible Belt areas, North Florida, and their constituents are not supportive of gambling. So I don't think you'll see the legislature doing that. I think if it happens, it would have to come from a referendum from the people. The legislature has had several opportunities to do that and have not taken advantage of those opportunities. So I don't see what would change then now compared to then. Mm-hmm.
Except they continue to get campaign funds from
Yeah, they do.
casinos.
They do. Yeah, they do.
Senator, can you think of an area where the state is spending too much money right now?
Well, I think the state is spending too much money on for-profit schools compared to traditional public schools. In the last legislative session, the state appropriated $75 million for the maintenance and upkeep of for-profit schools and appropriated $57 million for traditional public schools. Many of those traditional public schools are more than 50 years old, and many of them are located in my district. So I think that we are shifting our revenues to benefit 5% of our student population. And I say 5% because records show that only 5% of the students take advantage of going to the for-profit schools, whether they're vouchers or whether they are charters. So we have 95% of the students then left in schools that are crumbling around them, that don't have the technology that they need. And so I'm more concerned about the 95% than I am the 5%. So I think we have our priorities wrong there, and we're spending too much money on the for-profits than we are the traditional schools.
Your challenger is absent today, but he also has experience serving in the state legislature. Can you tell the voters what separates you from your opponent?
Well, I am accessible. I am open to questions and responding to the electorate. And I think that when you're going to set policy and you're going to write laws that affect people, that you ought to be willing to share your ideas and your plans so that they can compare and make an informed decision. So I think one of the first things that separates me from my opponent is that I show up. I'm here. He's not here. So I think that to dismiss the electorate is, and to show the kind of contempt that he has shown for the voters, I think is indicative of the kind of individual that he is and the way that he has legislated. Because in the past he has put his interest over the interest of people in the district. And I say that because one of the biggest things that we had to do a couple of years ago was to draw legislative lines. And while we are in a district that is now majority Democrat, it's a blue county, Mr. Siplin was working with the Tea Party Foundation and Republicans against Amendments 5 and 6, which would have increased potentially the representation of Democrats and the representation of minorities. He in fact sponsored Amendment 7, which says that even if Amendments 5 and 6 pass, they will be null and void. And he's running as a Democrat, so he has aligned himself with practices and principles that do not benefit working people and the people who elected him. And I think that is the major difference. I have never put my concerns over the interests of the community. And Mr. Siplin was paid, by the way, by the Tea Party Foundation group called Protect Your Vote, while he was advocating against Amendments 5 and 6. And you only get to draw the district lines every 10 years. So you've got to live with the results of what you do for a decade. And so we saw a judge in Tallahassee throw out congressional district lines that were still gerrymandered, even though Amendments 5 and 6 passed. And people have been focusing on the Republican operatives who were behind the scenes working to continue gerrymandering, but they haven't focused on self-serving individuals like Gary Siplin, who was being paid and was a mercenary seeking funding at the expense of his district. I think the biggest thing is I am who I say I am.
Can you give us an example of initiative or priority beyond things that we've already talked about that you've been responsible for that have drawn bipartisan support?
The amendment of the wrongful incarceration statute passed unanimously in the House and the Senate. So that gained bipartisan support. If you mean initiatives such as appropriations, is that what you're?
Well, let's make it a little easier. How about something unaccomplished on your agenda that's among your priorities that you think would draw bipartisan support?
Okay. I think if legislators understand the business implications of stand your ground, we could get bipartisan support, particularly if businesses are vocal and become involved in this whole issue. I think that we're at a point where we're going to have to make a decision about accepting $51 billion from the federal government to expand Medicaid to benefit people who are uninsured. There are 1.2 million people in the state of Florida who are uninsured. These people, when they get ill, go to our emergency rooms. And our laws require that the hospitals admit them. The law requires that doctors treat them. But that care is not free because the doctor is going to get paid. The hospital has overhead that has to be covered. They need medication that has to be covered. So right now, you and I are subsidizing that care through the emergency room, and it's the most expensive form of care. So I think it's an educational process. We've now seen the Florida Medical Association endorsing expanding Medicaid. The Florida Hospital Association is now endorsing expanding Medicaid. So it's been an educational process. I think we have to work with the business community because many of the people who work for businesses are low-wage workers who would qualify to be covered under Medicaid. And those are benefits that then the business would not have to be responsible for paying. They wouldn't have any risk of a fine because they have uninsured people. So that's one thing that I think I can work on to get bipartisan support. And the longer we wait, the less money is going to be available. And the important thing about it is people say, well, we don't want any federal money. It's not federal money, it's your money, it's my money, it's the citizens' money, and we send it to Washington, D.C. every April 15th, and it makes a one-way trip. And this is an opportunity to bring our money back to benefit our citizens.
Do you think that Florida should increase its minimum wage?
I do. We have one of the lowest minimum wages in the nation, and I supported last year an effort to increase the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. We have people who work every single day, but who are classified as impoverished, and they qualify for social services and benefits under the federal guidelines for poverty. And you shouldn't work every day and live in poverty. So I believe that we should raise the minimum wage, and it is a business friendly kind of thing, because the more money people earn, the more they spend. I'm also in favor of equal pay for equal work, because I think if women and men are working together and they have equal education, equal experience, and they're doing the same thing, that there should not be a disparity in their compensation. And the more women make, the more families are then able to acquire in the terms of goods and services that the family needs.
I think we can, we've covered some good ground today, and so we can conclude. I thank you for coming in
Okay.
today.
Thank you for the invitation.